Let's move now to the dominant firm model. The dominant firm model, which is also known as the price leadership model, has the following features. Many firms produce a homogeneous product, but one of the firms is much larger, the one that we refer to as dominant. The other firms are atomistic, which is a word we use to describe perfectly competitive firms. So they're going to be like perfectly competitive firms. But what's different here is that the dominant firm, which also is sometimes called the price leader, also has market power. What's weird about that is that that's in a context where there are a bunch of firms producing a homogeneous product. If that's all you knew, you'd say, hey, that's a perfectly competitive market. But again, what's different here is that one of them is dominant. One of them, think about it as one of them is really big. Now, how would that work? Well, here's how it's going to work. There's a market demand curve, as there always is. And the demand for the leader is going to be the market demand curve minus follower supply. And the key, really key fact here is that followers have higher costs than the leader. I mean, otherwise, why would they be a small fringe of followers as opposed to the leader themselves? And so we get this leader demand curve by subtracting follower supply from the market demand, and the leader then acts as a monopolist on the residual demand, basically on the demand that's not being served by the fringe of followers. And then the leader chooses price and quantity in the way that a firm with market power does, and that determines the market price, and the followers, they act as price takers and sell as much as they want at that price. Well, just like perfectly competitive firms do. So that's just an outline of how it works. What I want to do next is talk about an example, a real-world example that's kind of like this, and then we'll get into the analytics of the model. So here's an illustrative example, the world petroleum market. Certainly this is pretty much a homogeneous good. Now, the world petroleum market is dominated not by a single firm, but by an organization called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And that's 12 major oil-producing countries, the 12 listed here. Turns out that OPEC's oil exports represent about 60% of the total petroleum traded internationally. Because of this market share, OPEC's actions can and do influence international oil prices, which, by the way, is a quote from this source here. In effect, OPEC acts as the dominant firm. I want to just make the point with some data that OPEC's quantity decisions, so it decides how much output those 12 countries collectively will produce, that those quantity decisions affect prices. What this picture here shows, and this is borrowed from the U.S. Energy Administration, it shows the price of gasoline in terms of, or I should say crude petroleum, in terms of barrels per day, and that's the orangish line. And the blue line is spare capacity of OPEC. That's production capacity that's taken out of service to control quantity. And notice what happens here. So the price runs up around the time of an economic boom, and then when an economic bust occurs and then the price begins to fall, OPEC wants to raise the price and bring it back up. So what do? Well, they take a bunch of capacity and stop producing. So you see a big rise in the blue lines, and what that is additional spare capacity or a reduction in production, and that does have the effect of raising price from this minimum back up to some higher level. And so again, kind of big picture here, OPEC's quantity decisions do affect prices, and in fact that's what OPEC's goal is. It's to control quantity in a way that keeps price high. All right, let's get to the nuts and bolts. So this is literally it, the dominant firm model. And what are the ingredients? Well, there are really 3 ingredients in this model. The first is the market demand curve. The second is going to be the follower supply curve. And as I mentioned earlier, the leader demand will be the difference between those two. That is the difference between market demand and follower supply. And the third ingredient is the leader's marginal cost. Why is that? Because, well, Once we have leader demand based on the elements of this bullet point up here, we can get leader marginal revenue. Given leader marginal cost, we can find the leader's profit maximizing output as well as the price the leader charges, which in turn becomes the price that everybody faces. It's kind of a lot going on there, so we'll take it just one step at a time. All right, here's a picture. This line that goes from here all the way down to here and starts out dashed and then intersects this red part, that's the overall market demand curve. Right, so that's just the market demand curve. Second chunk, though, is the follower supply curve. So we're saying that at any price below this, the followers won't produce anything, but if the price were to rise, followers would produce along this supply curve here. So for example, if the price were up here, followers would supply this amount, which by the way is the entire market demand. Whereas if the price were down here, the followers would supply nothing. Well, using that information, we can derive the leader demand curve. So at this price, followers supply the whole market, and so what's left for the leaders is literally zero. At this price down here, followers supply nothing, and so what's left for the leaders is the entire market demand curve. If we connect this dot with this dot, what we literally have is the leader demand curve. So putting red on top of red, there you have it. Then there's a kink. But this stuff here, this and this, are the leader demand curve. The part that actually matters, though, since we're not going to try to be tricky, is this part above the kink. And so just summing up, the leader demand curve is market demand minus follower supply. Now adding some stuff in here, what are we adding in? Well, we can first of all get marginal revenue. How do we do that? Well, once we have the leader demand curve, we know how to bisect something, and so this leader marginal revenue is just obtained by bisecting leader demand. We've also added in the leader's marginal cost curve. Well, let's think about this. We have a leader who has a downward sloping demand curve and an associated marginal revenue curve and a marginal cost curve. So we know that we're going to find the leader's optimal quantity at the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. And indeed, there's that quantity. Where do we find the price? Well, we go up to the leader demand curve, and that's the price. Now a key point is, although this is the quantity the leader produces, this is the price that will be relevant to everybody. We know that in part because this is a homogeneous good and there can't be different prices of this across different firms. Let's go over to the box and make sure we've covered everything. So the leader chooses quantity based on MR equals MC, check. Then we find the price on the leader demand curve, check. The last point, though, is that followers produce where P equals the follower supply curve. So let's make sure we've got that straight. This is the price. Here's where it crosses the follower supply curve. So if this quantity here is what followers produce. Now notice that if all you had were the market demand curve, you'd say, well, at this price, market demand is out here, just following this along. And sure enough, this is consistent with what we're saying because this distance right here is the same as QF. It is QF. To say that one more different way, the total quantity at that price, QT, equals Q liter plus QF. All right, well, let's go over that again in a diagram that's kind of clean. So this is this shows us the prices and quantities, and again, we have this intersection of, whoops, got this intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost, and here's the leader's quantity of output. There's the price chosen by the leader. Well, at that price, followers want to supply along their supply curve, and that's this quantity right here. But by construction, this difference here between the total quantity and the leader quantity equals QF, the follower quantity. probably the best way to get control of a model like this is to work through an example. And so let's do that. Let's start with a very simple market demand curve. P equals 100 minus Q. Here's the follower supply curve. P equals 10 plus 5Q. First thing we need to do is find leader demand. So what we're trying to do is to find the quantity where follower supply equals market demand. That is, so if we want to find where leader demand has its intercept on the price axis, we want to figure out where follower supply actually, the followers supply the entire market. And so solving this, that is solving for the quantity where market demand equals follower supply, will give us that answer. And in fact, the answer is Q equals 15, P equals 85. So that means the intercept of the leader demand curve is at 85. Now how do we get the slope of the leader demand curve of DL? Well, we need to find one other point on the demand curve. How about where if we check out where follower supply first kicks in at a price equal to 10? Well, a picture will make it easier, I think, to see all this, so let's make one. What we're thinking about, we have quantity here and price here. This is the leader demand curve. Sorry, this is the market demand curve. Follower supply curve has an intercept of 10 and a pretty steep slope. So there's supply of followers, there's market demand. This intercept right here we derived, it's 85. Not quite drawn to scale. So what we're saying is at 85, followers supply everything, leaders have nothing as their demand. Whereas when the price falls to 10, followers supply nothing, and the leaders have the entire market demand as their demand. So the leader demand curve connects these two dots, and it's supposed to be a straight line, and if I were better at drawing it would be, but there's DL. So we have this intercept. We know that the leader demand curve hits the price axis at 85. The next thing we're trying to do, though, is find this slope. Now what do we know? Well, we know something about this point right here. This point on the demand curve is at a price of 10 and a quantity then of 90. So we have a triangle whose rise is 85 minus 10, or 75, and whose run is 90. Rise over run will be the slope. So slope of the demand curve would be equal to, we're going down, so it's minus 75 over 90. So we've actually got the answer, but just to make sure that we're clear on it, let's go to a cleaner slide. Again, the slope of this leader demand curve, slope of DL, equals rise over run, which is minus 75 over 90, or minus 5/6. So the leader demand curve equals price of the leader equals 85 minus 5/6 times Q. And that's relevant for quantities up to 90 where the kink kicks in for the leader demand curve. How do we find leader MR? Well, we just bisect, and so MR for the leader is 85 minus now 5/3 times Q. Well, if we just add in leader marginal cost, well, we're really off to the races. We can answer this question. So let's say that leader marginal cost is 5. Then we can proceed and find the answer. But before I do that, let's just talk a second about why we have such a low leader marginal cost relative to that follower supply curve, and ask the question, well, why is the leader the leader? The leader is the leader because the leader has really low costs compared to this fringe of small followers. They're small followers because they can't make very much without having a big increase in costs, whereas the leader is able to produce as much as it wants at a marginal cost of 5. Anyways, back to the story. How do we find the leader's quantity? Well, we set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, and so here the marginal revenue we just derived on the previous slide was this. There's MC. Solving that gives us QL of 48. Getting the leader's price requires us to plug the leader's quantity back into the leader's demand curve. Doing that gives us 45. Now, that 45 is not just the leader's price, it's the price chosen by the leader, but it's the price that's relevant to everybody. Given that price of 45, followers choose their quantity the way competitive firms do. In other words, they set that price they find the quantity on their supply curve such that the price equals that price. And so what's the follower supply? Well, it equals to 35 over 5, or just 7. Now let's check if this all makes sense. We're saying the price is equal to 45, and recall that the market demand curve was P equals 100 minus Q. So if the price equals 45, that means the quantity has to equal 55. Now let's think about whether the quantities add up. We said the leader quantity is 48, follower quantity is 7. Sure enough, 48 plus 7 equals 55. So big check. Seems like we got this right. Well, we did get this right. All right, so when does a dominant firm do well? Well, there are really 3 conditions. The first is that the product or market demand curve has to be relatively inelastic. And the second is that the follower supply curve has to also be somewhat inelastic. The reason, of course, is that the leader demand is market demand minus follower supply. And so if both of them are inelastic, then the difference between them will be pretty inelastic, which will give some market power to the leader. A third issue is that if the leader isn't a single firm, but instead it's a cartel, like OPEC, then of course it's also important to control cheating among the members. That is to make sure they stick to their quantity agreements so that the quantity that's chosen in this model is the quantity that they actually produce. Otherwise, with cheating, if members produce extra, that moves us along the market demand curve and reduces the price, which is good news for society but bad news for the cartel. So what are the takeaways from the dominant firm model? Well, I think the first is just this. Even if there are many firms in a market, in a homogeneous product market, there can be market power if some firm or cartel is dominant in the way we've described. Now, a second thing I'm going to call a takeaway is just the idea about how to work the problems. And here's how you do it. First, subtract follower supply from market demand to get leader demand. Then, get the leader marginal revenue via bisecting, that is by bisecting the leader demand curve, and this allows you to find the leader's quantity and price if you put the leader marginal revenue together with the leader marginal cost. And then finally, followers supply their quantity based on the leader's chosen price, and that's a price that applies to everyone. Using those simple ideas, or maybe not so simple, you can work the problems for this kind of market structure.